Dan Rubenstein, March Madness is upon us, my friend. How goes it?
It's really good. I love the NCAA tournament. I love college basketball. Whatever you have to say about the sport, however you think it has disappeared or thrived, or whatever your feelings are about arguably, I think it's the second biggest college sport, I would assume. All apologies to like the College World Series or women's basketball. I think it is. I love it. I absolutely like everything about it. That like I have no stake in the Iona Gales, and suddenly I will die for the Gales, right?
It is arguably my favorite 4 days of sports.
It's up there.
The first 4 days of the college basketball tournament, starting on Thursday. Many people are listening to this on Thursday and running through the weekend. The first two rounds for me are like, well, we can talk about it as we go through our little concept here and what it has meant to each of us over the years. Certainly working all these years in corporate America and having the basketball tournament as a distraction, as some great innovations have come and gone. Our friends over at CBS with the old boss button, being able to stream these games, it conjures up a lot of memories as we're going to go down memory lane here and talk about a bit of a college football spin on the NCAA tournament, right? You've heard of March Madness. We decided in the spirit of brackets, Dan, we were going to go through upsets over the last 4 years. So 2024, 2023, 2022, and 2021. We thought about going back a little bit further, but once you get to 2020, let's be real, it just gets weird. So we capped it at 4. We broke it into sub-regions, and we've got 4 upsets in each calendar year that we're going to pit against one another, and we're going to talk through all of them and come to, I guess, a final winner of these 16 upsets that we picked over the last couple seasons. This is going to be a 2-part episode, so this is part 1. We will conclude this episode on the Tuesday that follows. But this was a lot of fun to do, actually. We sort of spun our wheels a little bit trying to figure out exactly what we wanted to do, kind of to pay homage to March Madness. And when we settled on this idea and started taking a walk down memory lane and looking things up, it's funny how quickly some of these upsets, I don't know, get like rotated out of your brain and you forget some of these things that were a very big deal for if only a moment in time.
This is the opposite of chalk, right?
Chalk
is when you pick all the best teams. We're picking all the upsets. This is our, oops, all berries, oops, all upsets bracket. And so you really can't pick an upset because everything's an upset. And while you were talking about that, Ty, one of the things that I hadn't really considered about college basketball that I appreciate so much more than college football, and basically everything about college football to me is better. Obviously, having the centralized tournament with basketball is better than what football has to offer in terms of a centralized thing that everybody can get in on, whether or not you're a diehard or a more casual fan. It's that for a long time, you had major coaches at major places in their like 27th season.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter that, you don't know anybody who went to Michigan State. You don't root for a Big Ten team. You're from nowhere near the upper Midwest. You could just be like, I effing love Tom Izzo, or I effing hate Tom Izzo. You could be from, Galveston or Portland, Maine or whatever, and you get to form these opinions about these like little dictators on the sideline who are around forever. Every so often I wonder to myself, like, who is the coach of this team? And I saw this year, I think it's Leonard Hamilton's last season at Florida State.
Yeah.
I don't know how closely you follow college basketball. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No, I did see that.
He's been there since like 2000.
I follow next to nothing on the college basketball side until we get to the tournament. Then I start reading up. I'll watch Roger Sherman's video and things of that nature to try and pick a bracket. By the way, if you are listening to this at any point early on Thursday morning and you haven't gotten in on the bracket pool yet, free to play, go to verballers.com, sign up as a free member. You'll see the link right there. Get in. It's a free contest out on ESPN.com. We'll give away some shirts, some goodies to the winners.
Of course. No matter what Bill Self does with his career, I'll always remember Illinois fans after he left Illinois and went to Kansas and pretty soon thereafter lost to Bucknell. They would just call him Bucknell Bill. Yeah. And that was probably 18 years ago or something. I'm never going to forget that. I'm never going to forget Lehigh over Duke. That's just, that's forever there. Bryce Drew will never pay for a drink again in the state of Indiana because he's just that kind of legend. So there is something, and obviously there's the crossover with football, but yeah, the like long tenured, like I just can't stand Jim Boeheim, and I'm not sure why, but I just can't stand him. And now he's an announcer, I think, right? He's been gone for a few years, but we don't get that anymore. There's like Kirk Ferentz, and that's sort of it in terms of the major guys who've been around forever and ever. So I appreciate about the sport. I don't know if you have like these long-standing. I hate that guy. I love that guy.
I think any real sports fan has that, and in most cases there's no rationality to it.
Of course not.
You don't like a guy, either he beat your team or it said something in the press that you didn't like, or I don't know. Everybody's got their own reasons, but of course. So let me kind of bring it back to the concept here. As I said, we picked out 16 upsets that span each of the last 4 seasons. We have grouped them accordingly. On today's part 1 episode, we're going to go through your side of the bracket. So we both looked into all of these games, right? We know these games, I think, pretty well at this point, even though some of them definitely, as I said, rotated out of my brain. But eventually we're going to have the winner of the 2024 sub-regional going up against the 2021 sub-regional. And then on part 2, we'll do 2022 versus 2023. And we'll come to our, final game, and we'll pick which upset we think is the most meaningful. I do think of upsets in terms of which were the most shocking. Which were the most shocking in the moment, which are the most shocking to look back on. There were plenty of upsets. This is obviously not a complete list of all the upsets in each year. You can go out on Wikipedia. They do a great job out on Reddit chronicling all these games and which were the most shocking via the point spread, via the expectations.
I was going to say, I'd sorry to jump in. Do you have like a rubric of like how you are going to choose which upset was just like, so I wrote down in retrospect, or like, oh, well, they lost as like a 28-point dog, but then they went on to go 11-1. So like maybe not a crazy upset. I have an in the moment feel, like how bizarre and crazy did it feel living on the couch watching that game. Program size disparity I have written down. Like, is there, we're not going back 2007, but is there like App State, Michigan quality to this matchup? And then I have, and this is a little bit more vague and specific all at the same time, was there like a big upset moment? Was it a Hail Mary? Was it a strip sack to seal it? Was it, and then just like the tenor and rhythm of that upset? Is it memorable because you're like, oh, I can picture this specific play that defined that game? Does it have that? Does it not have that? Was it just sort of, hey, they played like a terrible team and the other team played well, and there's your upset. So that's what I have as like my rubric of sorts.
Yeah, I don't think mine is quite as specific as yours, but I tend to look at these through the lens of what was it like in the moment. I think the setting for a game is really important, not just where it was played, but a good example is we're going to talk in 2023 in part 2, not to give too much away, the Colorado TCU game to open up the season.
Right.
And so there was obviously a fair amount of anticipation coming into that game. It was Deion's first game. TCU was fresh off of a national championship appearance. And then by virtue of Colorado winning that game, first off, it was a great game. It was a fun game to watch. But because they won that game, the series of events that followed and the media firestorm that followed and the text messages that followed for you and I from people we hadn't talked to in a generation, frankly, that was, I think, a knock-on effect from that game that had it ranking pretty high for me.
Yeah, well, that was like
sort of the consequences of the result.
Well, and the unexpected, not that Colorado would win, but the unexpected construction of Colorado. We're just like, I have no idea who or what this team is, or who or what Deion Sanders is as a major conference college football coach.
Now, don't give too much away. I want to save some for the next episode.
But like, even though, and this is just an example, was my final thought. Even though I think it ended up being a 4-8 team beating a 5-7 team, you're absolutely right about the like in the moment feel of that game. Yeah.
Why don't we start with 2024? Let's keep it Let's keep it current. Let's start with our 2024 bracket. I
Okay.
guess we're just going to call this the Solid Verbal Upset bracket. Here are the 4 in the 2024 region, okay?
Mm-hmm.
The 1 seed is Michigan 13, Ohio State 10.
Oh, hold on. How about the delete 16? No? I'm going to workshop it throughout. Continue.
We've got, as a 4 seed, Georgia Tech 28, Miami 24. So we've got the Michigan win against the Georgia Tech win in round 1. And then the other pairing in this bracket is Northern Illinois 16, Notre Dame 14.
Yeah.
As the number 2 seed squaring off against Vandy 40, Alabama 35, that overtime win for the Vanderbilt Commodores. So this is a loaded bracket, Dan.
It is.
This is a loaded bracket. Do you agree with the seeding of these upsets, the way we have them laid out?
I think so. I mean, I don't think there's... I mean, you can repeat it for me because I only heard 3 of them. It was Notre Dame, Northern Illinois.
Yep, that's the 2.
That's the 2.
Vandy, Alabama's the 3. And then our first matchup here that we're going to talk about is Michigan beating Ohio State and Georgia Tech beating Miami.
See, I personally would have Vandy over Alabama as the 1.
Okay.
And the reason I'd have it as the 1 is that's where I thought my discrepancy was with the rankings. The number of years in which Vandy hadn't beaten Alabama, the actual rhythm of that game, the sort of sterling personality that is Diego Pavia at quarterback, personality in terms of like his playing style, that and it being at Vandy, which always heightens the emotion involved with the huge. I would probably put Vandy, perennial SEC doormat, winning that game, surviving like a resurgent Alabama in that game after a slow start. I think that would be my 1 seed of 2024. But yeah, I can be talked into whatever. But that's my general feel. But
well, the other thing that should be mentioned here,
yeah,
Alabama was the number 1 team in the country.
Alabama was the number 1 team in the country, and the line was, I think, around 3 touchdowns as an Alabama favorite.
Yeah.
It was somewhere around, I think, 20-ish points. So, and I looked up the closing line for all of these matchups, and it's all pretty similar. It's between 3 and 4 touchdowns, I believe, except for the Georgia Tech Miami one. So spanning 24 and 21 games. You have, and I don't know if you want to get into this now, but I think that's a good point by you as well.
Why don't we start then with our first round matchup?
Okay.
The reason that I put Michigan, Ohio State as my number 1 was mainly because, and this maybe is just some personal bias creeping in here, that game to me was so ridiculously shocking.
Yes.
It was so ridiculously shocking. Ohio State at that point, it was clear they were going to be in the playoff. One way or another, they were going to be in the playoff. They had lost to Oregon earlier in the year by 1 point. But this was a team that had everything going for it. Michigan still very much finding its way, especially on offense. We had gone to see that Michigan-Oregon game in Michigan Stadium. And even though I thought Michigan, to some extent, acquitted itself okay, especially on defense, it was just clear that they were very limited on offense.
Yes.
And so much of what they were going to try to do here was telegraphed. So while Alabama was number 1 when they ended up losing to Vanderbilt, Ohio State went on to win the national championship. This ended up being the best team in college football. And to lose in the manner that they did against Michigan, it was preposterous to me. So that's why I put them as the 1. And I had to put NIU Notre Dame as the 2. But
so then what's the matchup? It is this against Georgia Tech, Miami?
Michigan against Georgia Tech, Miami.
Okay.
So let's talk through the situation here.
Okay. So you can't really do it in retrospect too much, other than the fact that Ohio State was very clearly the best team in college football, even with that loss. So that makes it pretty huge. Obviously, the emotion involved in the Michigan-Ohio State rivalry makes it enormous.
4 in a row? 4 in a row for Michigan?
4 in a row. You could just fast forward this, Ohio State friends. Just fast forward.
Sorry, guys.
It's in Columbus. We have a taser involved. We have Ryan Day being confused about a fight and a flag at the end of the game with Michigan winning. My favorite in retrospect, personally, without having a dog in this fight, was the video that somebody made of Michigan walking into the shoe with the song from Sicario behind them. Have you seen this?
I saw that.
Okay.
Wow, that's a pull, man. That's a deep cut.
I'm a harsh critic of video edits after the fact. Like a lot of teams, an overwhelming number of teams and programs. Listen to me. They make these attempts to make these cool after the fact videos and recaps and like social media posts that I think come from an authentic place, but end up feeling a little bit corny. I don't know if Michigan made the Sicario video. I don't know who made it. I wasn't me. It wasn't Ty. It was one of the single best haunting college football videos I've ever seen, knowing what's about to happen with Michigan entering that tiger's lair, whatever, that I'm positive Michigan players weren't listening to the song as they were walking in. It wasn't blaring over a loudspeaker that somebody was holding. It's just something that added to the general dimension and character of that upset. So I include that. I include the fact that Michigan was down arguably its best defensive player in Will Johnson, arguably its best offensive player in Colston Loveland in that game. They were 19 or so point dogs, and all of the like ramifications in the short term about Ryan Day and his job and his status and his safety, like the implications were crazy after this one in terms of an upset. Now, the reason why I would take points away, Michigan was okay. They weren't catastrophically bad. Their quarterback situation largely was as they were shuffling between dudes, one of whom couldn't throw, one of them couldn't, Jack Tuttle went down injured pretty quickly and clearly wasn't going to be the answer. And Davis Warren was turnover prone. The game was weird with the interception, short field touchdown thing.
Yep.
But in terms of the reverberations and the general volume of this game, I don't think you can put, Georgia Tech, Miami, which we should talk about. But that's the case. Pretty easy.
I was just this game. I mean, you did a much better job kind of going through specifics. This game was shocking to me. It was a 22.5 point closing line. I just looked it up.
Okay. Yeah, I knew it probably opened around 2019. Yeah.
Everything Michigan wanted to do was telegraphed.
Yeah.
And that's not to say they didn't do a good job of it. They won the game. It was an ugly game. They needed to win this one ugly if they were going to win it all. They went on to win a bowl game against Alabama, who we're going to talk about here in
yes, they did.
A few minutes. So the way they closed out the season, all due credit to Michigan and Sharon Moore. This is not to take anything away from Michigan, but even Michigan people know how limited they were. And so the fact that everyone knew what was coming, including Ohio State, and Ohio State still lost, to me is what I think was the most perplexing. On top of that was the way that Ohio State played. Look at how they played in the playoff game, in all their playoff games.
Right.
It was a totally different team than what we saw against Michigan. And so I don't know if it was just they had this style in mind that they wanted to go out there and try and bully Michigan. They wanted to out Michigan, their hated rival, or something like that. But the game plan that we saw on display the final week of the season against Michigan was so drastically different from what we saw the rest of the way that it was truly a moment in which it was apparent to me that Michigan got in and was living rent-free inside Ryan Day's head. Whoever put that game plan together, I mean, they were thrown for a mental loop completely. And that's ultimately what was their undoing. Michigan played well and played a style that they needed to in order to win this one. But
intercepted deep in Ohio State's own end zone, own side of the field. But yes,
there is part of me that also is still wondering what the hell Ohio State was doing. What was this? What was this plan? That you get paid to do this? Who put this together?
Equal time, Ohio State people do claim that Will Howard took a big, potentially illegal hit and was dazed and wasn't the same after that hit, and it affected the kinds of plays that Ohio State could call and how much they wanted to test Michigan downfield. Michigan did run a defense that was kind of perfect to keep Ohio State in check and funnel their running game to their All-American caliber defensive tackles. The funnier thing to me, or another funny thing to me, other than the wonder of the Sicario video, I would imagine an overwhelming percentage of Michigan fans going into this game weren't of the mindset that, like, it's college football, anything can happen, and, there's emotion in this rivalry. I think just from afar, my feeling is, wouldn't it be hilarious if
Yeah.
Michigan won again? Like, not even taking seriously the idea of Michigan upsetting Ohio State because, oh, we have this guy, we can catch a couple breaks. And, it's a first-year head coach who, granted, beat Michigan as an interim last season or 2023. But I think that was the sentiment going in. They're like,
I
how
agree.
funny would it be if they still kept winning against this year's Ohio State, who brought back all these dudes, added these dudes, and still couldn't figure out Michigan at home. So Michigan fans weren't even really seriously considering this kind of outcome. And yet,
there you have it.
It's what
4
we
in a
got.
row.
Yeah.
4 in a row. All right. So we should give some time to Georgia Tech because Georgia Tech pulled off a pretty big upset of number 4.
Yes.
Miami at the time, number 4.
Undefeated.
Yeah. They were the first loss for the Canes this year. This one was played in Atlanta at Bobby Dodd Stadium. Of course, they rushed the field. This was Haynes King.
Sort of. Haynes King running it, and it was Aaron Philo?
Yes.
Throwing it. Neither one of them threw it all that well, but it was very clear that Haynes King's shoulder was an enormously limiting factor.
This was a recurring theme for Haynes King throughout the course of the season because Haynes King has proven nothing if not a warrior. We've seen plenty of instances now over his career where it's clear he's hurt. He is finding a way to grit it out. We saw that in the finale against Georgia, right? I mean, he plays hard every time he is out there. And I think if you're a Georgia Tech fan, part of the reason why you like him is he gives you a chance.
Yes.
It's an offense that revolves a lot around him. It's going to revolve more around him. But Haynes King, by and large, is a gamer. So you put him out there, you feel like you like your chances.
There were a couple things in this game's favor for me considering it to be not a better upset, but a comparable upset. Miami came into this game, I believe, with the number 1 or very close to number 1 scoring efficiency offense. That points per drive, they were just on another level. I think they may have even finished the season at number 1. Cam Ward, obviously a Heisman caliber quarterback this past season, and Miami hitting on offense on all cylinders could just rip off 3 touchdowns in 3 minutes, right? Just crazy efficient when things were operating. Very balanced offense. And Georgia Tech's defense, while improved, was not incredible. Definitely improved. Definitely had good players on it. And there was like the vibe of Georgia Tech after the Florida State game, even though in retrospect it wasn't an upset with how Florida State's season played out. We were like, oh, they're kind of like giant killers. They've beaten Miami now a couple times in a row in 4 of 6 matchups. And there was something scrappy, plucky about the all Haynes backfield. What do you call them?
Haynes your way,
excuse me. That Georgia Tech with a big, emotional, energetic character of a coach in Brent Key and sort of a folk hero name in Haynes King, who's been around forever. Jamal Haynes, a running back who gashes defenses in big games. The games at home in Atlanta and Bobby Dodd. Like there were a number of things, even as a double-digit dog, where there was a Georgia Tech vibe in this game. And they just kept gashing a very average Miami defense, mind you, but Miami in the top 4, top 5 at this point. It wasn't the only game that kept Miami out of the playoff. It was this game in Syracuse later on in the year.
Yeah.
But that Georgia Tech could figure out a way to win this game without a strong forward passing threat, similar to Michigan against Ohio State.
I was going to say it's good that we group these two teams or these two upsets together because both of the winning teams, two of the teams involved in the games had a similar thing going on. Yeah.
And even more so with Georgia Tech is their recent lows have been awfully, awfully low.
Yeah.
And so you can't say that really with Michigan, Ohio State. It's more the emotion involved in the rivalry. Georgia Tech, Miami, not a rivalry. But in terms of how Georgia Tech did this, I have this as, a top 4 upset of the season, but I'm going with Michigan, Ohio State.
I think we put Michigan, Ohio State through, but we also, on the topic of Georgia Tech, at least considered putting the Georgia Tech then upset of Florida State through
Yes.
into this. We've got some bubble teams, some bubble upsets that maybe we can talk through later. But I remember in the moment how shocking that was.
Yes.
And if I recall correctly, one member of the broadcasting duo here had the foresight, the wherewithal, the gumption to say in the ACC preview that it wouldn't be a shocker if Georgia Tech won that game in Ireland against Florida State. Now, yeah, maybe I was right about that. Was not right about Florida State's season. Nobody was. Nobody saw that one
I
coming.
may have had them either winning or playing in the ACC championship game going into the year.
No, nobody had that.
Yeah.
The season falling apart. So ultimately, I think we pulled that upset from the board and put this one up instead, because later in the season, with all the stakes that were at play, it just seemed like this was much more fitting, much more consequential.
There was the thing I would hold against that rivalry as well, other than the time of year when you didn't know what Georgia Tech was going to be, you didn't know what Florida State was going to be, is it was so clear in that game that, like, okay, Georgia Tech definitely doesn't have like a top 3, 4, 5 defense in the ACC. You can't make that kind of transition year to year, even with hiring the Tooch. Is that who they hired? The Tooch?
Right. So
we're like, okay, their defense might be improved, but it's not incredible. Florida State could do nothing on offense in that game. I don't think did they not score like after that point for a number of weeks, 20 points, 14 points?
It was something like that. Yeah. I forget the exact stat, but you're right.
It was something clear, even with it being week 1, even with it being overseas, even with Pat McAfee possibly throwing up in the pregame show or
that's
in
what,
the day
that's what
leading
they
up.
Tell me. That's what they tell me.
Then you're like, oh, something's very wrong with this Florida State offense. And so I take that away from the upset nature of that game, where it was like clear in that game. Maybe Florida State would be a bowl team or something. They're like, oh, something might be broken with this offense. And it turns out, yes, something was broken with that offense.
All right. So we're going to put through the Michigan win.
The slipper still fits.
And we're going to go to our second matchup here, which is between the Northern Illinois win over Notre Dame.
Yes.
And the Vandy win over then number 1 Alabama.
Yes.
I think you probably tipped your hand a little bit here in that you would have put the Vandy win as the number 1 overall seed. Seeding doesn't really matter.
No.
Because, we only have a limited number of games here. But let's talk through how we rank these upsets against one another.
So the way NIU won they picked off Riley Leonard twice.
Right.
And just sort of got enough stops, one in special teams, obviously, winning on the road, and not going on to have a stellar season at all, where it was just a magical day in Northern Indiana for NIU. Not affecting Notre Dame's season. That loss didn't keep Notre Dame out of anything, away from anything. They had the opportunity to just put it in the rearview mirror and win a bunch of games, which they did.
Right.
Their margin for error was less, because if you lose twice and one of them is NIU, good luck. But it, in retrospect, didn't really change Notre Dame all that much. But the idea that a MAC team, again, a smaller conference team, to go to Notre Dame, or a smaller program considerably, whether it was, Marshall or USF many years ago, or Stanford in Marcus Freeman's first season, astounding what NIU accomplished in South Bend.
It is. I remember watching this game and feeling completely different.
Yeah.
Than I did watching the Vanderbilt game against Alabama, because the Vandy Alabama game went to overtime. There were a lot of points. There was a lot of weirdness that transpired in that game.
Yeah.
And it really felt like you were on the edge of your seat. Whereas the Northern Illinois game, and again, I'm a little bit biased speaking as a Notre Dame fan, it was one of those deals where you're yelling at the TV, do something.
Yes.
Do something. What are we doing here? It didn't feel like there was a game plan. It didn't feel like Riley Leonard, but I mean, there was speculation that Riley had been concussed in that game. He played like it, even if he wasn't.
Right.
Nothing Notre Dame tried to do was working. It just felt like they were stuck in neutral. And this is a week after they beat Texas A&M, right? So it was like, what are we doing here? What is going on? Is this a letdown? Is this a look ahead? Is this a little bit of both? It was hard to tell on the Notre Dame side. So just in terms of like a neutral third-party observer, I have to believe that if you're one of them, you would pick the Vandy game because that was just a lot more fun to watch. I think the optics were better too in terms of a college football upset because you had the fans storming the field, you had them tearing down the goalpost, you had them marching the goalpost down and chucking it in the river.
Yep.
Shortly after the win. So there were a bunch of other like social media moments, let's say, that followed that game, 40-35 Alabama losing on the road to Vandy.
Yeah.
That I think probably elevates it a little bit more than Northern Illinois knocking off Notre Dame.
The thing I loved about NIU Notre Dame, other than NIU Notre Dame, was it was a really good ticker game. It was a really good Marcy Playground. Is that who sings Sex and Candy? Hanging Around?
That's right.
Where you're watching something else if you're not a Notre Dame fan or an NIU fan or just had money on this game. I don't know why like a neutral observer would be like, this is the game I am watching. I don't remember what it was up against. But you're looking at the ticker and you're like, ooh, NIU's up at halftime? Ooh, I'm filing that away. And then I think Notre Dame scored in the third quarter and went up 13-10 or something, 14-10. And you're like, okay, so Notre Dame is probably opening this game up. Like, okay, they figured it out. They're opening up the playbook a little. And they just didn't.
No.
Notre Dame didn't pull away, and they didn't make a show of it. And
No.
they didn't turn that ticker score quickly into 34-14 or something. And so that I always enjoy those where you're just like, at a certain point, I'm going to have to change the channel because there is 6 minutes left and this game's score isn't where it should be. And what is going on? And I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was 14-13. Notre Dame scored about midway through the third quarter. And then it was scoreless.
Yeah.
It was scoreless pretty much the entire rest of the way until Northern Illinois kicked a field goal with about 30 seconds left, a 35-yarder.
And that's kind of the best way to upset a team, right?
It is.
Because Vandy beat Alabama very much in an Alabama explosive, consistent offensive way. Like Vandy looked like a top 15 team against Alabama. NIU couldn't do much on offense. It was special teams, it was defense, but that's sort of like a really interesting upset formula where you look up and there's a no-hitter in the sixth inning, even though this pitcher has been giving up line drive after line drive, but like, well, it keeps going to the second baseman.
Yeah, they didn't do much. It was a bunch of plays from Ontario Brown.
Yeah.
Who had a long touchdown early, had 126 yards and a touchdown in the receiving game as well. So this was a very, very strange game for Notre Dame.
It does beat Vandy, Alabama in terms of program size discrepancy. That's the big advantage in terms of like selecting an upset. And the line was near 30 points, I believe.
28.5.
So it's a 4 touchdown plus line. 4.5. Yeah, 4 touchdown plus. So that gets it points, whereas I believe Vandy, Alabama was right around 20.
Yeah, that one ended up being 22.5.
22.5. Okay. So you do get points for that, and you do get points for it being on the road. But because the in retrospect thing of Notre Dame just destroyed everybody else basically on their schedule, you're like, well, it doesn't feel as impactful as Vandy, Alabama, because Alabama went on to be very good in some games and obviously struggled in a couple other games, and Oklahoma upset, whatever. And Vandy established itself as a clear bowl team. But I think the history and the baggage of Vandy, Alabama, bringing in, Diego Pavia, who was Mr. Upset against both Liberty and Auburn, following Hugh Freeze around, tormenting him.
Yeah.
Like Jerry Kill's been all over the sport. Clark Lee had started out his career at Vandy in disappointing fashion. And like, this has always like been a Vandy program that even when they show life, they're like, oh, they kind of float back to earth and go 6-6 or something. That Vandy was able to withstand the best of Ryan Williams, who was great as everybody knows, 17-year-old. That Vandy was able to do that and not luck into this game at all. They just flat out beat Alabama. They iced this game, making winning plays with the ball. It wasn't, a pick six at the end of the game for a shocking ending. It was taking care of business with their own version of Excelsior and high leverage moments. And so that's why that they looked like a big boy in this upset. I think I'm giving them the edge.
Yeah, I think I go Vandy knocking off Alabama, in part because it was number 1 Alabama.
Yep.
And also because this was, I think, the first time in the history of the Vanderbilt program that they had beaten a top 5 team. They were 0-60 going into that game against top 5 opponents, and they hadn't beaten Alabama on their field in 40 years. So there was a lot of like neck cracking going on after this one to finally get that out of your system.
This was also the week after Bama, Georgia. So that game was, it's a letdown moment considering the ending of that game. But that game was also like an interesting proof of concept for Alabama and Kalen DeBoer that like they could jump out to a big lead. They could let a team back in it as good as Georgia, or as good as we thought Georgia was at that time, and make the necessary plays at the end of the game to like, oh, there's still Alabama winning DNA kind of thing.
Yeah.
And like, okay, they figured it out. They're in a nice place moving forward with Kalen DeBoer in Alabama, and immediately lost to Vandy.
That's right. That's right. So, all right, we'll put Vandy through.
The slipper still fits.
Yeah.
By the way, I screwed up Ontario Brown.
Oh, no.
It was an 83-yard pass, and then on top of it, he ran for about 100 yards. So he was kind of the main offensive weapon for NIU in that win over Notre Dame. Don't mean to do disrespect to him.
Of course. And we have was it Tom Hammock? The
Tom Hammock. Yeah, the Tom
calling
Hammock.
Marcus Freeman after the game and saying like, hey, we noticed a couple of vulnerabilities in the armor.
In the Death Star.
Yeah.
All right. So who are we putting through between Michigan's win over Ohio State and Vandy's win over Alabama?
Michigan. I'm putting Michigan through in terms of an upset.
So wait. You would have put Vandy, Alabama as the 1 seed.
Yeah.
But now as we think back on this, we're putting Michigan through anyway.
So I forgot about the Sicario thing until I brought it up.
Okay. Is the Sicario thing the tiebreaker for you?
No, the actual tiebreaker is Kalen DeBoer felt heat after losing to Vanderbilt, certainly after losing to Oklahoma, not making the playoff in year 1, and I'm sure feels an immense amount of pressure, unlike what he's ever felt before as a head coach or assistant coach.
Right.
But it was his first season. Ryan Day, and it was Stromore's first season, of course, for Michigan, but Ryan Day basically he's been an undoubtedly excellent coach, college football coach, like nearly bulletproof. And he's lost these Michigan games. And we basically got to the point of saying he lost this game to a 500 or so team, and he must go. His record is 341-4. We really wish it was 343-2. So that to me, like the angst and agita and emotion around that specific upset, like you still feel the tremors. Whereas Vandy is a great one-off story over Bama. That's a perfect kind of upset. But the hilarity of Michigan doing it, the aftershocks and tremors, and that they won the national championship. Ohio State won the national championship and still lost to this very average Michigan team. And Ohio State fans were like, yeah, that was great that he won, but like, can't do it on that kind of path.
Look,
it's so funny and weird.
Dan, we're going to talk through 3 more groupings of upsets. We got one more that we're going to do on this episode. I'm inclined to put Michigan through against all of them. Now, we may have a disagreement, and you may talk me out of that. But as I look up and down this list, we've got a bunch of really good upsets here. This one, to me, even thinking back, and maybe there's a little bit of recency bias, okay?
Yep.
That's a real thing. Even looking back, to me, this is the biggest upset.
Sure.
This is the biggest upset because there is this whole element of, what? How? Why? So many questions that came as a result of Michigan winning. I still don't really know how it happened. I don't know. That's just me. but I'll put it through. We got to put it through.
All right. Quick bubble. Last two upsets out for 2024.
Oh, we've got a bubble. Okay.
I've got a bubble.
Yeah, good.
Or I guess it would be a fart, right? A stinky bubble.
Sure.
Kentucky over Ole Miss, 20-17.
Yes.
That was the indefensible loss that kept Ole Miss out of the playoffs.
Kept Ole Miss out, yeah.
Because of how good they were on both sides of the ball, how talented they were, what they look like in victories. Now, the end of the Florida game was not pretty, of course, for Ole Miss. Kentucky, with that being their lone SEC win, directly and explicitly affecting the college football and SEC race, that's perfect to me. On the road, I believe, in Oxford.
Yeah.
Kentucky being legitimately bad at college football this season, especially on offense. That to me was, it's just worth mentioning that they were considered. Also, Kennesaw State 27, Liberty 24. In Kennesaw's first FBS season, they've only had one coach, I believe, in the entirety of their program's history, who stepped down after they started 1-8 with the one win over Liberty, who the previous season was in I think it was the Fiesta Bowl.
The Fiesta Bowl against Oregon.
Right. They were the G5 representative in the New Year's Six game. They played a pretty bad game against Kennesaw State, the Owls. And was it a Thursday night, Friday night? I think it was a midweek game that Kennesaw just randomly was like, yeah, we're not great, but we can hang with some goofs and beat Liberty. And Liberty didn't play well. Kennesaw found some magic and consistently good, held off Liberty, who made a charge late. I just have to put that in there as an upset because Kennesaw was not good this year, and nor should they have been in their first season. That's really tough in terms of an ask. So that's where I'm going there.
No, I think you're right to call that one out.
Yeah.
Liberty was a huge favorite in that game. They were favored by 27 points, 28 points.
Unreal.
Somewhere in the neighborhood. And it was also, it fell at a point in the season where I feel like there was just so much else going on. It was easy to overlook this one. Liberty at that point in time was not necessarily a team we were talking about as potentially a G5 representative in the playoff, but obviously they entered this season with some of those expectations. So it didn't work out for them at that point in the season. It was October 23rd. Obviously it was clear it wasn't going to come to fruition, but either because we had overlooked Liberty and some of their playoff chances, or because Kennesaw State was a nice story taking the step up to FBS, or being part of this in their first full season. But certainly not a team that we were talking a whole lot about because there weren't expectations at all for the Owls. So for them to pull off this upset, it just kind of slipped under the radar, and it was crazy in its own right, but not necessarily one that had national ramifications. So.
The game before, Kennesaw scored 5 points against Middle Tennessee, a 3-9 team in Conference USA.
All right, so we're putting Michigan through. Let's go to 2021. So here are the 4 upsets that we pulled out for 2021. Our number 1 seed in this subgrouping is Stanford beating your Oregon Ducks. 31-24 in overtime.
I've had some down moments as an Oregon fan. That was in that grouping. Yep.
They will be squaring off against Bowling Green, miraculously knocking off Minnesota 14-10. The other matchup in this grouping is Jacksonville State 20, Florida State 17. Remember that game?
You got a Hail Mary in that one.
And Kansas 57, Texas 56 in overtime.
Yeah. Led to a viral solid verbal tweet, if I remember correctly. It was something like,
right.
It was a map of the United States, and it was, I said geographically mapping all of Kansas's 2021, was it 2021, right? 2021 FBS wins. And it was just a dot over Austin.
A dot over Austin.
Because I think they beat South Dakota to open the season and lost every other game, but scored 57 in an overtime winning effort against Texas. I love that moment.
Do you agree with the seeding on this? Okay,
Repeat it once again.
As we look this up and down, Oregon was the number 3 team in the country, I believe, losing to Stanford. It was a bad Stanford team.
Yeah.
I've got that as the number 1, just because I think that was the most consequential game.
It's a 3-9 Stanford team that they lost to in a no atmosphere Stanford Stadium. Yeah.
That's right. So we've got that as the 1, I think, just because it was the most consequential nationally speaking.
Okay.
I've got Jacksonville State over Florida State as the 2. I've got Kansas over Texas as the 3, and I've got Bowling Green over Minnesota as the 4. Now, actually, the Bowling Green Minnesota game in its own right was a pretty big deal.
It was the widest spread, right, of those games?
It was something like 30, 31 points
Yes.
in favor of Minnesota, and they still found a way to lose that game. So
Yes.
that was a shocker just in terms of big school, small school, bigger school, smaller
Yeah, of
school,
course.
and the point spread. You know, you factor that in. That's got to play a role here. So we've got the Stanford game going up against the Bowling Green game, and then the Jacksonville State game going up against Kansas and Texas.
I might put the Jacksonville State, Florida State upset as the number 1, just because in terms of the points scored for Florida State, an unacceptably low number, which I guess Florida State fans have gotten used to. That was Mackenzie Milton, Florida State. They made a change later on in the season, obviously, to Jordan Travis in 22. Jacksonville State, FCS team at the time.
That's right.
This is pre-Rich Rod, so you can't even say like, oh, well, you know, they've got this like much more experienced, much more accomplished coach. I believe Jacksonville State ended up firing their coach, just like the Brian Bohannon situation. Well, he stepped down technically.
John Grass.
John Grass. Always
Yep.
love when my coach shares a name with the playing surface. I don't know how else to rectify referencing John Grass. But Jacksonville State, the manner in which they won with that deep pass, which had kind of a Crabtree Texas Tech vibe in that he ended up near the sideline, the receiver did, and slammed on the brakes and then cut inside and was unable to be tackled by Florida State, that it was such a low moment for the outlook of Mike Norvell's future with Florida State. Even though I think it was his second season early on in Norvell's career, and it didn't get started off in a great way in 2020, but obviously you got to cut him some slack for, you know, starting your first huge coaching job in 2020. That Jacksonville State was able to pull that off. It's just on a different level. The game was in Tallahassee, yes?
Yeah.
The Stanford Oregon game was bad. It was David Shaw, it was Tanner McKee. Like, it wasn't a good Stanford team at all. I think it was Shaw's second to last season at Stanford. There were some good players for Stanford. It was just a team that didn't have a defense, I don't believe, and not any sort of offensive consistency. The other thing that involved in that game, not an excuse. Oregon still should have won, should have taken care of business. Joe Moorhead was not the coordinator in that game. Joe Moorhead had to have like emergency surgery. I don't know if it was an infection or
I think it was
or something.
Yeah, he needed an appendectomy.
It was an appendectomy. It was something
and
along those lines.
Yeah, he needed the emergency surgery because he had it.
Yeah, you can full on die if your appendix bursts and it's not treated. Yeah,
of course. And then I think we found out later that after the fact, like he kind of rushed it back to be the coach again to do his thing. He still wasn't fully 100% or even anywhere close to that, but he did come back shortly afterwards.
Yes.
But to the point, he was dealing with that amid this game. And
Oregon, Anthony Brown, Oregon team. Yeah,
it was Anthony Brown, Oregon. I believe there was an injury to CJ Verdell.
Okay.
But
even still, this was an Oregon team that went to Columbus and beat them.
Even still,
you gotta go to Stanford and beat them, right?
And they were number 3. They were the number 3 team, and they lost.
This was the first time. I'll make it personal because this is what I do. I remember watching this and immediately being so crestfallen and disappointed and disgusted that I was like, you know what? I now have, this was September, October, whatever it was, 2021.
Yep.
At that point, I had like a 6 or 7 month old. I was like, I'm just going to go wrestle with him. Like, I need something in my hands that makes me feel like this is a smaller deal than it's feeling like right now.
Yeah.
And so I threw my 6 month old around and had a great time. And that was a healthy dose of perspective. And that thus began my career of using my children as emotional props when I'm not feeling good about something else in my life.
I'm inclined to put this one through, but I do think we need to give Bowling Green some props.
Oh my God, yes.
Because this upset was truly out of left field.
It was
this one was
Morgan?
Out of left field. Yeah, it was a Tanner Morgan. Tanner Morgan was there for like 85 years.
Yeah.
But Bowling Green going to Minneapolis and knocking off Minnesota. Then early in the year, it was at the end of September. Again, the point spread was enormous. This isn't one that I think is going to conjure up memories for most of the people listening, unless you were a Minnesota fan or maybe a Big Ten fan,
right?
By extension. This isn't something that comes to mind. It wasn't for me. I had to look it up. But when you go back through and look at what was at stake here and just the fact that the spreads seem to be so drastically different, the fact that Bowling Green pulled this one off was crazy.
This was 2021. I don't think Minnesota really recovered. I don't know if you can pull up the schedule right now. I think it was a down year for Minnesota. Like it was not a good 21. The fun thing was Bowling Green, at least while Scott Loeffler was there until like an hour and a half ago. I think they beat Georgia Tech since then.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They've made bowl games.
They were plucky as hell last year.
I was going to say, they featured one of the most dominant offensive players in the sport.
Yep.
And that had been a program that was like a perennial 1-11 team. So to exercise the years upon years of demons, if you're a Falcons fan, and go to a Big Ten, a successful winning Big Ten team stadium as a 30-point dog, and come out of there, again, 14-10 was the final?
14-10.
It also had the feel. I remember this one. It also had that feel of a ticker game. You're like, what's the score right now? Halftime?
Yeah.
Third quarter?
Yeah.
And it's what? So I'm inclined to put a lot of respect on that upset for Bowling Green, even if it is not quite 3-9 Stanford beating Oregon. It was an Oregon team that was, I think it was very good, but it was Mario's last season. He got shelled by Utah twice in 3 weeks to finish things out. Was forced to give an awkward press conference ahead of an Alamo Bowl he knew he wasn't coaching in.
I remember that.
All-time favorite moment.
All right, so we're putting that one through. We got to put that one through, the Oregon loss, right?
Yeah, that's yeah, okay.
I think we got to put that one through.
The slipper still fits.
It was a 30-point dog.
It was a 30-point dog, but this wasn't nearly as good a Minnesota team as
that's
Oregon.
True. Yeah.
And also that Oregon loss, that one went to overtime.
And Oregon's rank too, I think, has to play a role in that.
It has to. It has to. That was just a better game.
Yep.
Jacksonville State beating Florida State, an FCS over Florida State, versus Kansas beating Texas in overtime. This is a crazy matchup, okay? This is a crazy matchup. I can tell you what I remember. These are personal anecdotes.
I watched both of these very closely. Yeah.
We both did. These are personal anecdotes here, okay? You did kind of the deeper dive as to what transpired within these games. But I remember the Florida State situation, and this wasn't all that long ago. Florida State in 2020, when Mike Norvell took over, that was a rocky situation. Remember, there were like culture issues within Florida State.
And they got rectified. They cleared the air, and I think he did a pretty good job of, airing everything out.
Absolutely. No, absolutely did.
Yeah.
Completely did. Was able to turn that thing around. That's part of why Jordan Travis was so, I think, important to that program. He was part of that project with Mike Norvell. He was there from the beginning, and it just took a while to turn it around, but it still was kind of a rocky start. And then to lose to Jacksonville State, there was a very real sentiment out there, at least among people that wrote into us. I remember just wondering, like, is this the dude? Is this the guy? Where are we headed here if we're losing to schools like Jacksonville State? This is not at all what the plan was going to be. Remember, this was on the heels of like Jimbo leaving and there being this, I think, prevailing sense within the Florida State program that change was needed. Norvell was going to be the guy, hopefully, to do that. But to lose a game like this, it was just a huge black eye, especially at home. And then you consider some of what I think you brought up with big school, small school, the disparity. The budget at Jacksonville State was $18 million for its entire athletic program. Florida State's was something like $150 million. I may not have those numbers exact, but there was a pretty big disparity just in terms of spend, as you might expect, FCS versus big-time FBS program.
Yeah.
So it was not a good Florida State team that season. It was better Jacksonville State school for whatever that's worth on the FCS ranks. But this one, to me, was just so ridiculously shocking that it happened, and building on some of what I think was already kind of a bit of turmoil with Norvell and what happened in year one. This one, to me, I'm inclined to put this one through.
Jacksonville State, with going into the fourth quarter, punted it after going 3 plays, negative 17 yards, down 10 points, and won this game.
Yeah, and then there was the Hail Mary.
And then you have the singular play, which is the thing I have down here. Like, was there that special moment? And arguably the biggest special moment of any of these games I'm talking about here was that pass from, I think it was Zarek Cooper, the Clemson transfer, Jacksonville State. I think this was the day I learned that Jacksonville State was not in Jacksonville, Florida. Personally, speak for myself here. I don't know why. Anyway, that was nice for me to learn in 2021 as an FCS team. So yes, it was the singular moment. It was year 2. It was now like the most celebrated up and coming coach as offensive coordinator for Florida State in Kenny Dillingham.
Yeah.
Mackenzie Milton was not the answer. He got replaced by Jordan Travis, I think a couple games later for, I want to say it was either Louisville or Syracuse. And Florida State had players. They had decent players. It was a good Jay-Sean Corbin game. It was a crazy penalized game. So it was pretty arrhythmic. Jacksonville State, Florida State combined for 24 penalties for over 230 or so yards combined. So it had that feel of like every time Florida State looked like they were going to build on a lead, they kind of shot themselves in the foot. And Jacksonville State had had the long drive and then got the ball back for the long play. And it was an unfathomable upset to me at the time that Jacksonville State could do it and go into Florida State. So
yeah, at the time.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of unfathomable.
Yeah.
The Kansas win over Texas was pretty wild too.
Oh man.
Okay. So you got to understand the circumstance here. This is why doing a little bit of the background study and understanding where these games fell within a team's season, within a team's like story arc for that year. That's where this is important, because Texas was struggling. This is not a great Texas team, but Kansas was worse. Kansas was way worse. This was a 2-10 Kansas team, I think, at the end of the season. And I think we've now come to respect Lance Leipold, but these were early days for Lance Leipold at Kansas. We didn't know if he was going to be able to turn things around in the manner that he has.
Right.
So Texas, which constantly was kind of the butt of this joke as, is Texas back? No, they're not back. I remember telling a lot of that joke this season because it, again, was not a great Texas team.
This season?
That season.
Oh, that's it. Okay.
Not this season. That season.
The Casey Thompson season for Texas?
Yeah. This was an absolute mess for Texas to lose this game and for Kansas to win. And I guess maybe it was a harbinger of what was to come for Kansas. Obviously, they have built themselves up nicely, and the program is seeing a bit of a rebirth now under Lance Leipold. But this was just like the ultimate punchline. Later in the season, it was insult to injury for Texas for a season that had already come off the skids.
Yeah. I'm in love with this game. So Kansas goes 1-11.
1-11. I said 2-10.
Oh, excuse me. No, 2-10. They beat South Dakota and they beat Texas. They have one FBS win.
One FBS win. That's right.
One FBS win. So in this game, this is sort of, I believe, like the starting debut of Jalen Daniels. And that's as a third string quarterback. It went Jason Bean into Miles Kendrick. Bean is beat up and ineffective. Kendrick is beat up and can't go on. Jalen Daniels comes in relief, throws 3 touchdowns, including 2, I think it was a walk-on tight end for the win, Jared Casey.
Right.
So you add in third string, walk-on, only FBS win, on the road, dropping 50. offense hadn't been good in 2021 for Kansas. I think Casey Thompson threw 6 touchdowns in this game for Texas. And yet, Texas, I think it was the middle of the field on defense, could not figure Kansas out. It was just wide open. Devin Neal, I think, had himself a game against the Longhorns. The defense was just a nightmare. They could not figure out this Kansas offense. And crazy to think about now, but I don't know how this happened. Truly. The next 2 years, Sark lit into Kansas for whatever he felt in 2021. I think they combined to score like 95 points in the next 2 seasons combined. And you knew it was important. You knew it was personal to him. And there was the early version of Sark at Texas had that reputation of jumping out to big leads and giving them away and not looking good in the second halves and overtimes. Texas couldn't get it done in the second half. They tied it late to send it to overtime.
Right.
Couldn't get it done in overtime. And Kansas somehow, some way. And this is another one of those situations where they were such a joke for so long.
Yeah.
That to be able to win this game against Texas in Austin, I think it's my number one.
I think you can make that case. I mean, the other thing that we should call out, and I know I kind of alluded to this.
1 in 10 against FBS teams.
1 in 10 against FBS teams. Lance Leipold's first season, Steve Sarkisian's first season.
Yeah.
All right. So these were 2 coaches that were trying to take over something of a rebuild at their respective schools. Obviously, the Kansas season did not go well, but the Texas season did not go well either. I've referenced that a couple times.
No.
This happened in the middle of a 6-game losing streak for Sark towards the latter half of the season. They ended up finishing 5-7. They didn't make a bowl. Kansas obviously didn't either.
Right. Totally.
But just the fact that Kansas could find a way to pull off this upset, just the fact that they were able, as you said, to be running free for a good chunk of this game. There were a ton of points. It did go to overtime. As you mentioned, the stats were kind of pinball numbers across the board. I think I am with you. The Jacksonville State one was shocking, but it was earlier in the year. At this point in the season, one of the concerns that you have is that all the shock value is gone. Like, if you don't have a team that you are rooting for and maybe your team's already out of it, one of the main reasons we watch college football this late in the season is we're hoping for upsets like this.
Yes.
Texas wasn't highly ranked, obviously. There's a little bit more meat on the bone if you're talking about a ranked team that's playing for something in the postseason, i.e. the Michigan-Ohio State game. This game was not that. But this game was shocking in its own right because Kansas had been a perennial doormat. And Texas was trying to get over being the butt of that joke.
Right.
And the fact that they didn't, and the fact that they couldn't in this game against one of the worst teams in college football, to me, was mind-blowing. So I think I put them through. I think even though the Jacksonville State win over Florida State was something else, I'm inclined to go Kansas and its win over Texas, putting it through to square off against Stanford and its win over Oregon.
This is sort of separate, but I like the opportunity to note that in this season, Sark lost this game. Sark and Texas lost this game and jumped out to a 28-7 lead against Oklahoma. Oklahoma brings in Caleb Williams off the bench for an inconsistent at best Spencer Rattler, an ineffective Spencer Rattler, comes back and wins the game, despite Texas having Casey Thompson throw 5 touchdowns and 0 picks, have Bijan Robinson go for 7 yards per carry, and Xavier Worthy go for 260 yards. Future, like, very good NFL receiver. I think he's good, right? He plays for the Chiefs, Xavier Worthy.
Yep.
How do you lose that? That defense needed a moment, and they got there. But man, year 1, 5-7, you said was what they did in 2021.
5-7, yeah.
That's a stretch. That was a stretch for Sark.
It's even crazier if you think about where Texas is at now.
Of course.
You know, Texas has obviously turned itself around, and this is a program very much in the zeitgeist. Losing to Kansas in year 1, it's just like,
yeah.
All right, we're putting Kansas through.
The slipper still
I'm putting
fits.
Kansas through.
So that brings us to, I guess, the final question of this episode. Okay. We've got Kansas going through to square off against Stanford.
Oh, I definitely have Kansas.
I think it's got to be Kansas, right?
Okay, so both Stanford and Kansas were incredibly down that season.
They were incredibly down. They were both 2-10. Or no, I guess Stanford is 3-9.
3-9.
Stanford is 3-9.
Kansas giving up 56 points in a winning effort in overtime. That to me is crazy. So I tip my cap there. And they were both overtime games. You have to give points to Stanford for beating a ranked team in Oregon, a highly ranked team in Oregon. But there's something that I just look back on. I look back, I mean, obviously as an Oregon fan, in anger, like Oasis warned me not to do. I look back in anger with that Oregon game, and there hasn't been anything of consequence with Stanford since. And I now look at the, like, in retrospect, that was like the beginning of Kansas crawling and scratching into something.
Yeah.
And I don't know. The entertainment value of that Kansas-Texas game, I'm going to give it to that. And maybe call me a homer who doesn't want to put through an embarrassing moment in Oregon's recent past through, but I'm going Kansas. Feel free to disagree.
Well, I think speaking for the Verballerhood, or the portion of the Verballerhood that doesn't have a rooting interest.
Yeah.
Undeniably, Kansas getting that win was more of a feel-good moment.
Yeah.
Because they had been so down so long. Even Stanford at that point, right? Stanford had a bad season, but Stanford had experienced a fair amount of success under David Shaw.
Agree.
Right? So Kansas getting a win like this, just after season after season after season of being the laughingstock of the Big 12.
Totally.
This is a big deal. It's a big deal to get this win for Lance Leipold. You can make a pretty good case that he used this as something of a springboard to help make that program better. You know, for a while there, they were getting better each and every season. So I think I'm with you. I think we put through our 3 seed.
I'm also inclined, because of the environment was better.
I agree.
In the Texas-Kansas game, that it was back and forth, that the crowd was into it, whereas, like, there's just not that at Stanford. There just isn't.
So we're going to put this one through. On our next episode, we will talk through, I guess, the Final Four matchup between Michigan's upset over Ohio State and the Kansas upset over Texas in 2021.
Can I give you my bath bubbles?
Oh, your bath bubbles. Yes, please.
My stinky bubbles.
Yeah.
I have Fresno over UCLA. Now, Fresno was good, and UCLA was fine, but that was a crazy game. That was after UCLA upset LSU. There was a big Jake Haener game for Fresno, and I have my soft spot for the Mountain West, and the California teams, the Mountain West. And then in 9 overtimes, Illinois over Penn State. Brett Bielema's first season.
So I was at a birthday party out of state.
Yeah.
Didn't have great reception and was trying to watch this game on my phone. And it was, you talk about ticker moments where you're looking at the ticker, waiting for it to update, wondering if there's a glitch. I kept refreshing my phone thinking that something was wrong.
Of course.
Because this just did not make any sense. I couldn't watch it.
It was just a wild wind atmosphere.
Ugh.
I want to say it felt like 15 helicopters were landing where everybody's running out of the way and briefcase papers are flying. Like, nobody could throw the ball in this game or really do anything on offense. Yeah.
This game was a disaster. It was a novelty because I believe this was the first year that they went to sort of the penalty kick thing.
Yes.
Where you're trying 2-point conversions after you get a little bit deeper into overtime, after 2 or 3 overtimes.
But I think it was
whatever the rule was.
They changed the rule after this to start the 2-point conversion sooner.
They did.
Maybe I'm making that up. I don't know. Yeah.
Something like that. But this was kind of like our first real foray into how goofy college football overtime can get. And I just remember distinctly trying to get my phone to update, getting back to the car, getting on the highway, realizing like, oh,
right.
This wasn't a mistake. My phone was right. The reception was fine. This game was just off the hook.
Yeah. So the rule was instituted before the 2021 season. So this was the first example of
that's right
a game, but it was a lot of failed 2-point conversions. It wasn't a back and forth of
no. That's why I went to 9 overtimes.
That's why it went to 9 overtimes. Unlike Georgia Tech, Georgia this year, where there were a bunch of successful ones during that process. The reason why this was a stinky bubble and not an entrant was the actual football being played in this game was abhorrent. It was very, very bad.
It was barely football.
It was Sean Clifford in the wind. It was Art Sikowski in the wind. I think Jahan Dotson was on this team for Penn State, but Mike Epstein for Illinois. It was not an entertaining game. It was a hilarious game, but not a memorable football part of this game.
No. I also have Montana over Washington.
Oh, yeah.
So Montana was, I believe, a top 10 FCS team at the time of this game. This was Washington under Jimmy Lake, which is a season that went off the rails. They went something like 4-8. Obviously, Jimmy Lake didn't last, but just anytime you got an FCS team winning, this was another example of it. So Montana's a pretty good team. The Grizz was a pretty good team, but did not necessarily see them beating Washington. And also, how about Texas A&M knocking off number 1 Alabama that year?
Yes. That was Calzada?
I believe so, yeah. The Calzada Armada.
Yeah, that was Calzada. And the thing that was especially painful about the Washington-Montana game, I'm trying to be as neutral as I can here, is opening game of the season. Was it not? So you say to yourself, all right, Jimmy Lake, he has all the success as a coordinator, takes over as a head coach, and makes this like incredible hire, and John Donovan to run the offense. And
John Donovan. Oh no.
I think Montana was good that year. Were they not?
Yeah, they were good.
Like it was they were a top 10 FCS team, I believe. Yeah, they won 10 games. So basically an extremely bad version of Washington lost to a very good FCS team, which still shouldn't happen ever, given the size of Washington's program, that they've been a recent playoff team, but speaks to how inept that offense was under John Donovan and Jimmy Lake running the show. And just it was a really shrewd move by Washington after the second year. And obviously there was the stuff off the field and locker room stuff where they're just like, nope, this is not the guy. We're moving forward, and found their guy briefly. And this game is sort of lost to time to all those who don't choose to remember the glory that was the Jimmy Lake era at Washington.
Man, Washington scored on what looks like their first drive of the game.
Yeah.
And then not at all the rest of the way. They lost 13-7 to Montana.
Oof. Yeah. And it was on Washington's own field. Yeah, of course.
Tough watch. All right.
Yep.
When we return for part 2, we are going to go through 2022 and 2023. We're going to put those winners against one another. We're going to put the Michigan upset up against this Kansas upset. We're going to eventually come to some agreement on what our favorite upset was over the last 4 seasons. Please weigh in, solidverbal@gmail.com. If you have any thoughts, if you have any personal anecdotes that you'd like to share, you can always send those in to us either via email or on any of the social feeds, or if you can post a comment. If you're watching this out on YouTube, if you're listening out on Spotify, there are a number of apps now that let you put comments alongside these episodes. We cherish the personal anecdotes, frankly, where you were, what you were doing, what your reaction was.
If you're at the game, if you're at, watching it with a fan of one of those teams. Yeah.
We cherish that stuff. So if you wouldn't mind sharing that with us, Dan and I would be very appreciative. Of course, forballers.com is where you can go. If you're listening to this, if it's still before the tournament tips off, we would encourage you to get in on our free pool, play for a shirt, play for some goodies. If nothing more, just go out to forballers.com, sign up for the free tier. Maybe you're a little bit late, but we've been putting some crumbs out on that free tier as well. Give you a little bit of an incentive to just sign up and be part of the community. You don't got to pay. It's fine. It's fine. Sign up for the free tier. We love to have you with us here throughout the off season where we're doing 2 episodes a week.
That's it.
I think that's it for part 1.
The slipper still fits.
For those of you who are listening before the tournament, maybe you're listening during the tournament, hopefully those brackets aren't too busted by the time part 2 rolls around. Hopefully I'll still be in my 2 survivor pools that I play in every year. It's my favorite pool that I play in.
Yeah.
I will keep everybody updated, I promise you, Dan, throughout the course of the next couple weeks. For that guy over there, my good friend, Dan Rubenstein. For myself, Ty Hildenbrand, thank you so much for coming on this journey with us. We'll talk to you in part 2. Stay solid.
Peace.